Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the New York Insurance Association's Executive Speaker Forum, the Cannabis Conversation. I am NIA Vice President Cassandra Anderson, and on behalf of NIA, thank you for joining us today. It goes without saying that the topic of roadway safety in light of the legalization of marijuana is a timely one. A number of states have legalized cannabis, including Colorado, and there have been ongoing discussions in New York. Within just the last week, both the National Traffic Safety Board, NTSB, and the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS, delivered warnings on drug-impaired driving. NTSB has asked the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to develop standards for roadside drug testing of drivers by law enforcement. IIHS announced that studies have found that auto accidents have increased by as much as 6% for states that have legalized marijuana compared to their neighboring states that have not. Given the safety concerns, NIA's goal is to provide more information as cannabis is further contemplated here in New York. We are pleased to have with us today someone who is an expert on the effects of legalized recreational marijuana on roadway safety. Sam Cole is the Communications Manager for Traffic Safety for the Colorado Department of Transportation. As Sam has said, Colorado began a grand social experiment in 2014 that few of us saw coming. He will provide us with a sense of what it was like being on the front lines of that social experiment and how Colorado rose to the challenge. I am sure his 20 years of public sector experience and responsibility for 11 safety-related campaigns for Colorado's DOT came in quite handy in tackling this huge issue. Before turning it over to Sam, I would like to mention a couple of things to keep in mind as you participate. Please feel free to type a question into the question pane on your computer screen at any point. We will be monitoring questions posed during the presentation, but will allow Sam to conclude his presentation before addressing specific questions. We are recording today's webinar and will post the recording in the members section of NIA's website. Sam has also supplied us with his slides for the presentation, and we will post those as well. And with that, I now turn it over to you, Sam.
Well, thank you, Cassandra, and greetings from Colorado to everybody there in New York. And thank you to the New York Insurance Association for inviting me to provide you with a glimpse into what's happened in Colorado since marijuana was legalized here recreationally. And I think I'll start just with a little bit of background on where we are. So marijuana was passed by voters and legalized in 2013. Marijuana dispensaries started opening up in 2014, January of 2014 in Colorado. And now there are more dispensaries than there are Starbucks in Colorado. So it's really taken off like wildfire. And as a state agency, we've had to respond to educate people and to keep people safe. And here at the Colorado Department of Transportation, we're charged with keeping people safe on our roadways by working with law enforcement. So for those of you that don't know, Colorado is one of 9 states that have legalized marijuana recreationally. And we bring in about $280 million in tax revenue. That does not go just to the general fund. That actually has to go towards marijuana education around the dangers and legal consequences in all forms. So we target youth education, we target breastfeeding moms around education, and certainly getting our law enforcement trained so that we can prevent DUIs on our roadways. Some of this money, the tax money, also goes towards building schools. So it doesn't just go into the general fund. So the question I get from literally all around the world is, now that you've legalized marijuana in Colorado, is the sky falling? And I would say no, the sky is still up there, and the sky is not falling in Colorado, even from a traffic safety standpoint. People will then tell me, well, you know, Sam, that traffic fatalities in Colorado are up by 30% since marijuana was legalized. And that's true, but there's nothing in our data to indicate that traffic fatalities are spiking because of marijuana. Traffic fatalities are spiking across the country over the last several years, both in states that have legalized and not legalized marijuana. So that's the easy answer. Good news is that we've been able to educate drivers on our roadways who consume marijuana that they can get a DUI. Now over 90% of marijuana users know they can get a DUI for driving high. We've trained hundreds of law enforcement officers on how to identify drug-impaired drivers. But the bad news is we have way too many marijuana users that are driving high. So I'm just going to start going through some of these slides. And this will not go towards my next slide. Let me try this. There we go. So in today's discussion, I will talk about some of the traffic safety impacts on legalizing marijuana. I'll talk about the law enforcement response. I'll talk about some of the challenges that law enforcement has had in detecting and arresting drug drivers. And most of my slides will focus on public education, because that's what I do here. I educate the public around the dangers of driving under the influence of marijuana. So just talking quickly about what has happened from a fatality standpoint in Colorado since legalization, we've got 2 years worth of data, 2016 and 2017. And the legal definition of impairment by marijuana in Colorado is 5 nanograms or higher of Delta-9. Delta-9 is the form of marijuana that causes impairment, that will cause you to drive impaired on our roadways. So if you look at the third set of bar charts there, we had 52 fatalities in Colorado in which 5 nanograms or more of Delta-9 was found in the driver's bloodstream. That number actually has come down since 2016, and we had 35 fatalities in which Delta-9 was found in the blood of a driver involved in a fatal crash. So that is our legal definition. I have, for comparison reasons, some of these other bar charts on here. We are looking at the presence of Delta-9 increasing, but when you look at that level as set by our legal definition in the state, the number of fatalities is actually decreasing. What a lot of people like to point to is this bar chart, and this is just presence of marijuana in fatal crashes. And presence does not indicate impairment. As I mentioned, Delta-9 is the impairing form of marijuana. When marijuana enters the bloodstream, it's fat soluble, it gets absorbed by fat and is stored in the body for up to 2 or 3 weeks. So it quickly does turn into a waste product. So it's probably nothing, it's not startling to me to see marijuana turning up in the bodies of, or in the blood of drivers arrested. But I think we got to be careful because, as I mentioned, the presence of marijuana does not indicate impairment, since there's many different forms of marijuana that can exist in the human body. But this is interesting. This is interesting that we're starting to see it increase. This might have something to do with just more of use of marijuana in Colorado is increasing versus people driving impaired, because our fatality data, as we saw in the last slide, does not indicate that fatalities are skyrocketing because of legalization. So how have we gotten law enforcement prepared? So about 12% of law enforcement's DUIs were for marijuana before legalization. That has since gone up to 15%. So it has ticked up. That may have a lot to do with the fact that our law enforcement are much better trained on how to detect marijuana during a traffic stop. So for example, all of our state troopers, all 600 state troopers, have advanced training in drug detection. And also there are 300 specially trained drug recognition experts that can be called to the scene of a traffic stop to assist a state trooper. We also have the first green lab in the country that helps train law enforcement. Literally, we get people high and then we have law enforcement work with them, so law enforcement's better trained on how to identify people who may be impaired. There is no device that we use roadside, because we really do depend on law enforcement's ability to detect through a person's behavior. if they are impaired by alcohol or drugs or a combination. Some of the challenges that come forth in doing a DUI arrest is that, even though the state has a legal definition of 5 nanograms of delta-9, this science around linking a specific impairment level to a nanogram level just is very poor. It doesn't exist. In fact, the International Association of Chiefs of Police has recommended that any states that are legalizing marijuana do not set a nanogram level for delta-9, just because the science isn't there. Although I will say that Canada just adopted Colorado's 5 nanograms delta-9 as their level. Canada just legalized recreational use nationwide. That went into effect just the other day, actually last week. And as I mentioned, marijuana does metabolize differently in the body. It's very complicated. The other thing that we have to work with is that we're not getting complete data because 1/3 of drivers refuse a blood test. So we don't know what was in their blood. They still get charged and they still get their license taken away if they do refuse a blood test after they're arrested. But in the end, we don't know what was in their blood that was impairing them. We are seeing an increase in drug driving overall. The presence of drugs in the blood of people could have to do with the opioid epidemic in this country or just the legalization of marijuana. And the other thing is that the cost of a drug test is an impediment. A lot of law enforcement officers will arrest somebody for alcohol, and if alcohol is obvious, then no other tests will be required because that law enforcement agency is going to have to pay for that test. So if they can arrest somebody for DUI for alcohol, why continue to test them? I'm the person here at CDOT, the Colorado Department of Transportation, that does all the public awareness campaigns. I've spent the last 4 years trying to reach out to marijuana users across the state to educate them on the dangers and the legal consequences of driving high. But what we've heard in focus groups from marijuana users is that they do not want to feel criminalized. So we have to take a neutral stance rooted in education about the law and the dangers of driving high. And we need to connect to users in a very real way that establishes trust. So as I mentioned, we did focus groups before we launched our campaign. We came up with an initial campaign that was very lighthearted. And we got some pushback because people were saying, driving high, driving impaired is a serious issue. You can't make fun of it. And we're like, well, we need to educate marijuana users. And the best way to educate people is through humor. So we actually used humor, and I'll show you one of our ads that we put out in 2014. The name of the campaign was Drive High, Get a DUI. And in fact, after this initial campaign ran, over 40% of Coloradans had heard of that slogan. We did a post survey of Coloradans, Drive High, Get a DUI, and over 90% of marijuana users now know that you can get a DUI for driving high. So the campaign was really successful, but it was humorous. And let me just play one of the ads that we ran. So there you see it. We did use humor, but you can see the State Patrol was heavily involved in the creation of this campaign. And but you see that it was non-judgmental. We don't care if you use marijuana, but we care real hard if you use marijuana, then you drive. So after the success of that campaign in 2015, we started another campaign which did get more serious, which featured several ads were put on billboards showing a grinder with a crashed car in it, showing a crashed car that looks like a marijuana joint with taglines saying hits lead to hits, or grinding one can crash the other. And then for those of you who don't speak Spanish, this is billboard that said, if you light this up, don't start this up, don't drive high. And let me play another ad, which is a little bit more serious in nature, although still a little lighthearted.
19% of DUIs in Colorado are for marijuana. Why? Because marijuana impairs reaction time. Reaction time is important, as proven by the fact that you can't catch this skip ad button. Marijuana decreases your reaction time, making you an unsafe driver. If you're high, don't drive.
So it's true. You know, I mentioned before that 15% of DUIs in Colorado were for marijuana. We did actually spike at 19%. So State Patrol went from 12% to 19%, but we're back down to 15%. So I think that is that's encouraging, and that's because of some of our awareness efforts. This is an example of the billboard. This is a three-dimensional billboard put on the side of a hotel in downtown Denver. It actually glowed at night. It got lots of attention, lots of news stories. We raised a lot of awareness by doing these very hard-hitting things that had never been done before. So a big billboard, downtown Denver, hits lead to hits, glowing, smoking at night. It was really a success. The other things that we did these I guess I call them stunts, PR efforts. We took this car in that Ford Focus, that green Ford Focus there, put a smoke machine inside of it, just parked it at fairs and festivals, 420 events, and slowly, and then we walked away. Remotely, it would fill with smoke, and then drive high, get a DUI would light up in the windows there in neon lettering. As people gathered around to see, you know, who was hotboxing in the car. The other thing we did at 420 festivals, very slowly, we drove these two vehicles around where people were gathering for 420 festivals, like around parking lots and that sort of thing. One vehicle has a big marijuana leaf on it, as you can see. The other one looks like a cop car, just to reinforce the fact that you can get a DUI for driving high. Then we took these arcade games, looks like just a normal racing arcade game. We placed them in dispensaries across the state. People walk up to play a racing car game and they look at the display and it reads, CDOT reminds you, playing video games while high is legal, driving is not. Play a non-driving game. Just kind of a humorous way to get across this notion that you shouldn't be driving high. Then at the point of sale in the dispensaries, we had these big posters so people understood that an edible can delay its effects. In other words, you got to wait 2 hours before an edible's effects will hit you, and you don't want to be behind the wheel of a car. A lot of people will eat an edible, they won't feel anything. They'll eat another one, they won't feel anything, and then they'll get behind the wheel, and that could be a dangerous scenario. And then we also had these tear-off cards that were that bud tenders would give to marijuana purchasers, cannabis consumers, on some of the basic laws around consuming cannabis in Colorado. That, for example, you can't leave the dispensary and go out into your car and start using the cannabis. You got to wait till you get home, and that you cannot bring it out of state. The other kind of fun thing that we did to work with the marijuana industry, you know, and this is kind of funny, we cannot keep these 420 mile markers on our roadways at all. It's very difficult because they get stolen. So we said, well, why don't we make the best of that? Why don't we get little miniature 420 mile markers printed up? We'll place them in hidden spots at 420 fairs and festivals. And then when cannabis users find them, they turn over the little miniature mile marker and they can turn it in to get $42 Lyft ride credit. We're trying to get marijuana users to think in terms of alcohol. A lot of people use rideshare programs for alcohol, but they don't necessarily use it for marijuana when they're impaired. We're trying to get people to think the same way about marijuana as they do for alcohol. We also partnered with Lyft with the 320 movement. We want people to think of 320 as the time when they plan ahead for a safe ride before 420 hits. 420 is the time historically when people get high. So we created the 320 movement campaign. People go to the website, they can download the discount code, and they can also read about some of the dangers of driving under the influence of marijuana. But we've been doing this for 4 years, and I have to tell you, it does get a little frustrating that survey after survey, people still tell us that between 20 and 50% of marijuana users in the state are driving after using marijuana. So we decided this year to take a step back and have what's called the cannabis conversation with cannabis users in Colorado. Let me just fix the screen here for a sec. We called it, our tagline for the campaign was, let's hash it out. Together we can find solutions to driving high. We really wanted to find out from marijuana users why they drive high, knowing that they can get arrested, knowing of the dangers. Is it because they don't believe law enforcement will be able to detect that they're impaired? Is it because friends are not holding them accountable? Is it because they just don't believe that they are a danger to society? So we wanted to have a broad-ranging two-way conversation with marijuana users across the state to find out what they were thinking so that we can design a campaign in the future that connects and changes their behavior better. So we partnered with universities, we partnered with marijuana dispensaries. Of course, Lyft has been a great partner to try to get out our information. And that information came in the form of a huge, probably the biggest online survey around driving under the influence of marijuana ever conducted. We drove, now it's 15,000 people to take our survey, and these are mostly marijuana users, answering those questions. What are their values? What are their beliefs when it comes to driving under the influence of marijuana, to help inform our ability to change their behavior? We had town hall meetings across the state to have one-on-one discussions with people about their values and their thoughts around this. And then we, of course, also attended booths and festivals. In that lower picture, in case you're wondering what I look like, that's me with a microphone and a green shirt. And then, you know, what's nice is we had a paid media campaign. We get $1 million from the tax funds to be able to push out our public awareness campaigns around the dangers of driving under the influence of marijuana. So we're able to do a pretty robust paid ad budget, both online and even using some of these billboards in downtown Denver. And we got a lot of news traction. The news media loved it, and in the end, we were able to garner more than 35 million impressions, which means number of people that saw our ads. So we developed a short video, which we based on what people were telling us. And then we took this video and pushed it back out and got people to respond. But let me show you kind of what some of the people told us.
I think people drive high because it's probably part of their routine, a daily activity they do. They probably never think twice about it when they get behind a wheel. And also, I think there's a conception out there with most people that driving impaired on cannabis is safer than driving under alcohol.
Unlike being drunk, your attention is a little bit more focused on your task at hand and what you're doing.
They're selfish. Most people are going to drive and go somewhere because they want to, regardless of what damage they could cause.
Do you think driving high is an issue in Colorado?
I don't think driving high is an issue in Colorado. I think out-of-state drivers is a bigger problem than people driving stoned.
Driving high is an issue in Colorado. Driving impaired is an issue in Colorado. It is something that law enforcement is going to look at. Driving under the influence of marijuana is not acceptable. It is a choice people make, and it is not the proper choice.
Do you think you're a better driver when you're high?
I think I pay more attention when I drive high. I definitely believe I'm not as impaired as if I were to drive drunk.
There's a misconception on what people think. People think they pay attention more when they're high, but at the same time, you can daydream.
I would not know. That's kind of like people saying I drive better when I'm drunk or tired.
Do you drive high?
I drive high a majority of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I do.
So that gives you a flavor of what we heard. And I see we've only got a few more minutes, so I'll just go through these last slides really fast so that we can get to any questions you might have. Some of the themes that have come up during our cannabis conversation is that, and I'll just read a couple of these, people would like to see drug driving safety campaigns that are both emotional and based on scientific fact. People are also telling us there's a critical need for better research and testing for measuring marijuana impairment. We know that. But things that are really upsetting to us is people are telling us that being under the influence doesn't affect their ability to drive. Something about 10% told us that they think it makes them a better driver. Almost every marijuana user thinks alcohol is more dangerous. And this is really my last slide. As Cassandra mentioned, there was a study it just came out by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety that compared states that have legalized marijuana with states that haven't, showing about a 6% difference in crash rates. In other words, states that have legalized have a 6% higher crash rates. But it's not just the study that they did is not just for crashes involving marijuana. It's all types of crashes. And we dug into the data a little bit, and when you separate out Colorado instead of lumping them with the others, our crash rate is on par with our neighboring non-marijuana states. So I thought the study was helpful, and it's certainly a piece of the puzzle, but we like to look at crashes that actually involve marijuana, and those are the ones that we're tracking. So that's my contact information. Please come to Colorado. We get more snow than you guys do in a lot of different parts of New York, although I know Buffalo does get tons of snow. But yeah, so that's my presentation.
Thank you, Sam. Colorado's journey is definitely a fascinating one, and without a doubt, you came up with some really clever marketing. I'm really interested to continue to hear what your experience is like there, and what you've been able to put together is quite impressive. But I can certainly appreciate that your work is far from over. I encourage participants at this point to type questions you have into the question pane. While we give everyone a minute to type, I have a question I would like to ask. What impacts would roadside testing have on the problem, in your opinion, Sam?
Well, I think if there was a roadside device, it would help law enforcement figure out if somebody was under the influence of marijuana. In other words, there's a roadside device for alcohol that you breathe into that provides information to law enforcement when they're trying to figure out if somebody's impaired by cocaine, or are they impaired by alcohol, or is it marijuana or opioids? Or did they just take too many sleeping pills? So that would help. Right now, we just rely on law enforcement's standard field sobriety test to figure out if somebody's impaired by drugs.
Thank you, Sam. If there's one thing other states should learn from Colorado's experience, what should it be?
Well, I would think one of the first things states need to do is start right now collecting data on marijuana impairment, and not just presence of marijuana in traffic crashes, but the presence of Delta-9, which is the impairing form of marijuana, and instructing coroners to be able to provide that information to the state. Because you saw that I only had 2 years worth of data on Delta-9. It's because our coroners did not collect that data. So we didn't have a good before and after picture of what marijuana impairment looked like in Colorado. So definitely, I think that's a good first step, getting your data in order and starting to train law enforcement officers on how to recognize drug impairment.
Thanks, Sam. We did have one question come in, and I asked for some clarification. I'm not sure if it'll be coming, but it says, is there an increased % correlation involving accidents? I don't know if that's something you can speak to, given that information. Does that ring true for you?
I mean, I think that they might be talking about the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety report, in which Colorado did have, or when you combine Colorado with other marijuana states, there's a higher rate of accidents, but not necessarily accidents that involve marijuana. So if that's the question, there's proportionally higher number of accidents that involve marijuana. No, we're just not seeing anything in the traffic safety data that makes marijuana the bad guy in all this. We do know that marijuana has contributed to traffic fatalities for decades in Colorado. Ever since people have been driving and doing marijuana, there have been crashes because of that marijuana. I guess the other thing to look at is, are people consuming marijuana more in Colorado since legalization? Because then you would assume, well, if they're consuming more, then they're probably driving under the influence more. And according to our health department here, the consumption among adults has remained steady over many years. About 15 to 20% of adults use marijuana. So it did not spike after marijuana was legalized.
Great. Thank you very much. I think at this point there are no further questions, so I will conclude the program. Thank you again, Sam, for talking to those of us in New York who can benefit from learning more about Colorado's experiences. And thank you to everyone for joining us. As I previously mentioned, the slides and recording of the program will be in the members-only section of our website, nyia.org, so you are able to view again or share it with your colleagues. Thanks again, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Sam.